Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Keep It Fictional, a book podcast for book lovers, by book lovers, from the Port Moody Public Library. I am your host today, Corrine, who didn't know she was the host until about 15 minutes ago. And we are joined here today by my fellow book friends, Virginia and Emma. It's a small little triad here today. It's just the three of us, which is such a shame because in previous years when we've done this topic, I have really enjoyed Sadie's picks. I feel like she always brings something very much in her wheelhouse, but describes it in such a way that I would be very intrigued to read it. And so this episode, we are going to be broadcasting in May. Is that right, Virginia? Because it's very much April right now. Okay, Virginia is has the entire schedule of recording and publishing somewhere in her brain that we mere mortals do not understand. So we are recording in April, but this is going to be put out in May. And May is Asian Heritage Month, or Asian American and Pacific Islanders Month if you are from the United States. And this was declared in 2001 from a Senate motion from Senator Vivian Poy. And it is to celebrate the contributions of people of Asian heritage and descent in the history of Canada. And I believe that their tagline is to kind of reflect on that history. And so we are very privileged and excited today to kind of take an aspect of that in that we are looking at literature by people of Asian heritage, either in translation or from the diaspora, from various places. And I think it's really important, as we constantly say when these months come up, is don't just hem that in that reading and that reflection into 1 month out of the year. We should be constantly kind of looking around to see whose voices aren't represented by kind of mainstream publishing, or who aren't getting those kind of marketing dollars. And I think this is kind of particularly of interest, as someone who comes from a children's librarianship background, as do all of us actually, is that according to the 2019 diversity study by the We Need Diverse Books group, even though, at least in Canada, StatsCan says that around 20% of the population describes themselves as being of Asian heritage or descent, only 8.7 of all books published for children feature main characters of Asian descent. 8.7, which is a fairly staggering fact when you consider that 41.8 of all main characters in children's literature are white. And for certain years, there are more protagonists who are animals than people of color. And so it's important to, while celebrating what has been done so far and not forgetting the work of amazing authors who have been kind of pushing publishing and making sure that their voices have been heard in situations and circumstances that are quite difficult. There have been people fighting this battle for such a long time. And so it's very exciting to kind of celebrate three fantastic books and authors today. But there is still so much work to be done. It's a constant uphill battle to kind of ensure that hegemony of publishing doesn't take over again. And so today we are going to do one of the wonderful things that we get to do, and we get to celebrate three fantastic books. And I'm going to celebrate with a local author. Yes, not just a local author, but a local poet. Yes, today I will be playing the part of Emma. I have even done glasses and hair. Yeah, and I thought about anime today because I just heard that the Yuri on Ice movie has been canceled, and I'm devastated. Oh no, Emma, did you not know? Oh no. Oh, I feel really bad now for you to be kind of experiencing this in real time. Do you need like a moment? Should we pause the podcast? Okay. Are you okay? Okay. Well, if you are playing the Keep It Fictional drinking game, get ready to get wasted because I'm going to bring up my favorite topic of interest, which is, of course, BTS. Because my discovery of this particular book is strangely BTS adjacent. And you wouldn't necessarily know that by looking at it. From the outside, this seems like a very tenuous connection to Army, and yet it is there. I first discovered this book and this author translator through the Twitter feed of Anton Her, who is, of course, my man, Anton Her, translator of several books from Korean into English. Many of those books were chosen because they were recommended by RM of BTS. And so he knew that there would be a built in audience of keen readers, and so has translated several of those works. He is also the author of the upcoming book, Toward Eternity in July, which we talked about in our last podcast of Most Anticipated, which I'm both anticipating and not. I just can't stop thinking about nanobots. Anyways. So on his Twitter, he kind of brought this story to the attention of BTS Army as the plight of a fellow translator. So Yilin Wang is a Chinese diaspora writer, poet, translator, and editor living on the traditional unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And one Saturday, she was kind of taking a break from all of the work that she does, and she stumbled upon a Facebook post. This had been recommended to her probably by the algorithm at work because it was about a poet that she felt kind of like a particular kinship and had translated some of her works before. Qiu Jin's poetry was being featured in an exhibit at the prestigious British Museum. The exhibit was called China's Hidden Century. And she was, again, intrigued because she had translated several works from this kind of poet revolutionary who had lived from 1875 to 1907. And again, she was a poet, a writer, an essayist, founder of the feminist publication China's Woman's News. She practiced cross dressing, she learned sword fighting and horseback riding. She got a traditional scholar's education in the time when women were usually denied education. And she tried to overthrow the Qing dynasty and fight for women's rights. She passed away at 31 years old, standing in conviction of her rights. Now, she's usually celebrated as a revolutionary, as a great thinker. And so Elin was kind of intrigued to see that the British Museum was focusing on her poems because very few of them have been translated into English. And very few people kind of recognize her as being an author of poetry. So, as she kind of watched this video and saw some images at the exhibit, to her horror, she discovered that they featured her translation, and the complete translated text of one of the poems, A River of Crimson, A Brief Stay in the Glorious Capital, that they had never asked her permission for or even credited her work or paid her. She first discovered that they were using her words, her translation, her labor by accident. Now, the British Museum, as John Oliver often calls it, the world's largest active crime scene, when they were faced with this accusation, simply shrugged. It happens. You want us to apologize? I'm sorry. We're the British Museum. You should be thrilled. You should be happy that we translated these words or that we featured these words. And, if you're upset, then we'll just take them down. This was not an acceptable answer. To just erase her words again would be erasing her from the exhibit, would be burying her story again. And so Yilin took her fight public. For 2 months, she fought the British Museum. She fundraised for legal fees from several groups of translators, editors, different circles of interested parties. And I learned about this from Anton Her retweeting her plight and talking about how this is just another example of people mistreating or misunderstanding translations and feeling that the work of Asian writers, the work of Asian translators is simply up for grabs, that it's not valuable or worthwhile in the same way that an Anglophone poet or translator would be. Now, eventually BTS Army caught this, and we started fundraising for her legal fees. This fight went over 2 months, and I have no doubt that it was a taxing struggle, not only dealing with the intellectual theft, but as she writes in her essays, the gaslighting, the microaggressions, the straight up racism. But after 2 months, eventually a settlement was reached. It was an uphill and painful battle that should not have been fought at all. Translators are artists. Translation is an art form. And so this poem that was featured at the British Museum, as well as the works of 5 others, are collected in a really quite beautiful book of poetry that is wonderfully translated by our local poet, our local translator, Yilin Wang, in this collection bound together called The Lantern and the Night Moths, 5 modern and contemporary Chinese poets, which brings together translated works of 5 different innovative, barrier busting, unique and fascinating voices that kind of play with old techniques of poetry as well as creating their own. What I really appreciated and love about this particular collection is that so often, especially if they're kind of like works in translation, is that there's this so much focus on the ancient and the old, is kind of keeping the idea of these cultures and these places in the past, and that there has been no modernity. And so I love that she chose these modern poets to really reflect upon. Um, and what I think makes this kind of like an essential work is that it not only has the beautiful translations of the work as well as the original in simplified Chinese, is that after each kind of selection of these poets, I'm going to get pretty nerdy here, is there are essays. There are fantastic, amazing essays that kind of explain her approach to translation. They talk about her experience of these poems as part of the Chinese diaspora, as part of her process of kind of bridging Anglophone and Sinophone poetry together, the nuances of trying to take like a certain line or a certain understanding of an idiom and kind of move that into a way that English readers can understand or connect to. Um, I mean, if you're into poetry, this is a treat. If you're into someone really grappling with like the art of translation and how these poems kind of connect to her own identity, and how she kind of really feels the weight and responsibility of ensuring that these voices kind of reach a larger audience while also kind of like rejoicing in the joy and playfulness and thought of these poets who are working with these old and traditional formats, but kind of playing with them to make something entirely new. Um, Again, I am absolutely delighted that that this book has been published. I am hoping that I'll be able to catch her maybe a presentation in Vancouver at some time, um, maybe when National Poetry Month. Um, she describes her kind of process. Many translators talk about translating as like giving birth, like you gestate the poem and or book and or whatever, and then well, you birth it. But she describes herself as more of a nurse. So she sees these poems as needing a bit of tender love and care to help them recover, to bring that extra shine to them. Um, yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating read. I bought my copy and I've already got my little like sticky notes in it. And you know there's going to be more. You know there's going to be more sticky notes. So yes, if you are looking or interested by any of those ramblings on my part, I would heartily recommend picking up a copy of The Lantern and the Night Moths. All right, I'm going to swing this over to someone who I know loves a book in translation, and that is Virginia.
Well, you could have also swung it to somebody who loves a collection of poetry. So one or the other, right? Yeah. But I feel like you're trying to get me into reading a collection of poetry. I think that was sort of your ulterior motive. Just keep saying the word translation 1,000 times. Anyway, so a couple of us talk about how much, speaking of things we like, how much we like interconnected stories recently. So I brought one of those to the podcast today. This is a debut book by Mai Nardone, a Thai American author who lives in Bangkok. And this is called Welcome Me to the Kingdom. And I'll encourage everybody, once you finish reading this book, to look on the cover because there's just so many things on the cover. You think it's like a haphazard, like kind of collage of stuff. It's actually all very much related to the book. So these are stories that are set in over a few decades, and they mostly take place in Bangkok, Thailand. And we get characters introduced in some stories, and then those characters reappear later in stories that feature other characters. So hence that interconnectedness of it all. And we start with the story of Nam and P. They came from Isan, which is in the northeastern part of Thailand, and they decided to try their luck in the big city, hoping to get a better life for them. P has asked for 30 days. 30 days where he can get a job and prove to Nam that he can take care of them both. In his pocket is a crumpled piece of paper on which he counts down to the days as they pass by. And as the deadline draws near, both P and Nam knows that this is not happening. P can hold a job. Even if he was lucky to get work, he just can't hold a job. There are too many migrant workers in the city. So P, even though he doesn't want to acknowledge it, knows that Nam has decided to go into sex work. And that's where she met Rick. Rick, an American who has just landed in Thailand, recently divorced, and was sort of forced into this trip to Thailand by his buddy because they think, oh, you need to go relax, you need to go have a good time. Thailand is the place to be. It's a paradise with all these beautiful women. You need to be there. And Rick wasn't sure whether this is what he wants, but he met Nam. And we know that they got married and they have a daughter, Lara, together. And we follow Lara in a few of the stories as she struggled to be a mixed race person in Thailand. And that doesn't matter where she goes, there's always that same prejudice against her. She's not Thai enough, she's not American enough. And when she moves briefly to America, she has to use like whitening cream so that she can fit in more. And no matter where she is, she's always considered an outsider. As a kid, her mom took her to sort of like a cult-like gathering where the parents they take turn like channeling spirits to try to get rid of like the stuff that is bad in their kids or something. Her family doesn't always get along, and she would purposely speak English with her father so that like her mom doesn't understand her. When the financial crisis hit in 97, Rick decides to head back to the States to find a better job and earn some money. And Lara blames her mom for driving her dad away, even though it's supposed to be a temporary. Lara has a feeling that Rick is not coming back. But there's also the Nam that Lara doesn't know. And she only got a glimpse of her in a photograph of Nam when she was younger. She was on a motorcycle and she was smiling. She looks radiant. She was so happy. What happened to that Nam? Lara wonders. We also follow Benz and Tintin and Big. They call themselves the Stray Boys. Knowing that they're going to be aging out of the orphanage soon, they need to come up with a way to make a living. They live next to a river and a lot of stuff get thrown out and wash up on the shore. So they see that, well, there is an opportunity here. Like I can trade in all these like scrap metal, the spare parts, and all the other stuff for money. And so the boys thought of a quick way to get up all the stuff. They use like a badminton net so that they can catch everything as the tide comes in a lot more easily in a lot less time. And this has been working great. And they got some savings and they thought, yeah, this is how we're going to get out. This is how we're going to, be okay. Until the police got a hold of their little enterprise. And the police is not happy. Even though everything that they're doing is legitimate, they're not doing anything illegal, the police is not happy because they're not part of this money making scheme. And when Tintin and Benson and Big refuse to share, the police decide to crush it. We meet others who are struggling in this city, trying to make ends meet, trying to make sense of their lives there. We meet an Elvis impersonator who's opening a bar. We meet a Thai Muslim woman who's being bullied and ostracized because she performed abortions in the community, which is a much needed thing, but everybody consider that to be amoral. We meet someone who placed a bet on fighting chickens. Supposedly they got one with the pedigree from a line of champions, and they thought like, yeah, this is it. This is how I'm gonna get money. Until the chicken runs away from a fight. And all of these people, no matter where they came from, whether they were born there, whether they came from other parts of Thailand, from China, from America, all of them came to this city with so much hope, but they slowly realize how many things are stacked against them. It's a fairly difficult book to read because I think it's a lot about people trying to survive and barely surviving. And it's about this life in this big city taking a real toll on them. And sometimes it feels like there's not a lot of hope in the stories. Um, and the city just seems to like kind of chew you up and spit you back out and just taking all your hopes and dreams with you. And I think the title itself, like welcome me to the kingdom, is kind of like a plea, like it feels very much like, these characters are just asking, please, can you just let me in? And since these stories feel kind of like they're connected because of the shared characters, yes, you can read them as short stories, but it's when you can see how their lives intersect that just add this extra layer that makes these stories that you can read as a standalone, but much more kind of like a lot deeper. I love the Stray Boy stories. I think that was like super touching for me. I love the story about Hasma, the Thai Muslim person who does abortions, and there's a little bit of a supernatural kind of bend to that story. But one of the big themes in the book is also sex tourism. And the author's own experience too as a person of mixed race, as he said, like when you have a white father and a Thai mother, people just automatically assume things. And in the story, when we first met Rick, the author actually uses the second person to tell the story and is trying to get us into the mindset of someone who's just visiting. We're just here to have fun. But because we just met Nam already in the previous story, in the previous chapter, you get a very different read on the story when you're being addressed as you are the one who are doing all these things. Mai Nardone talks about how, he grows up in neighborhood that you know that there are sex parlors around. They are in your neighborhood. You might even live near one. And it's just you walk by it every day and sort of what that means. And, like as you grow up, he start thinking more about that. And he wants to write about that Bangkok that he knows, as in the prologue, the characters came to the city, and there was a sign that say, "Take home 1,000 smiles." And of course, it's aimed at tourists. It's aimed at people who are just coming, to have fun, and then they get to go home. But what about all the people that live there? Like, what is their life like? And that's what he wants to write about. Um, Even though, like I said earlier, it sometimes feels like there's not a lot of hope in these stories. But in the last story of the book, where we see Benz and Tintin became volunteer paramedics, and trying to bring people to hospitals. They talk about how, like, perhaps, if they can get enough karma points in this life, maybe in the next life they will be born into a bed of pearls. So if you like, stories, short stories, if you are looking for more Southeast Asian fiction in your reading life, if you want to see that Bangkok, the Thailand underneath that glamorous service, if you like sort of character-driven stories, but you also like novels, like I think that's these interconnected stories work really well in sort of both sense. So yeah, so I wanted to recommend that for today. Welcome Me to the Kingdom by Mai Nardone. Also, just, I'm putting extra books on here. If you're looking for more Thai authors, this one just came into the library, so I thought I brought it into. This is The Understory by Senai Sangsuk. This is actually written in Thai, so it's been translated by Mui Poposco. And this one is about sort of the magic of storytelling. Is celebrate, like storytelling and how important it is in a small Thai village. And I have started this, and I feel like just like all the kids in the village there, we're just waiting eagerly for this 90-year-old monk to tell the story about sort of what life is like. So it's a really, really fun one too. So yeah, so check that out. And I will pass that back to Corinne.
All right. Well, thank you, Virginia, for your book and also for cheating and throwing in another book while you were at it. That's so unlike you, so out of character. How strange. Yeah, you shake your head, but it's so true. So true. All right. Well, we have a collection of poetry, we have a collection of short stories, and now we're going to hand it over to Emma for like a huge chonker of a novel.
Cool. This is a chonker. This is a real chonker of a novel. So as you all know, I typically do already read a lot of Asian literature. I'm a big manga fan. I like a lot of Japanese literature. I've read only some of the classics, but I've really enjoyed Osamu Dazai and Ryunosuke Akutagawa. Um, and like I said, you guys know I love manga, and I do like a lot of the more popular, kind of like easily consumable Japanese lit. Like what you're looking for what you were looking for is in the library and books like that. So I do already read a lot of Asian literature, but this week I wanted to celebrate a different aspect of not just Asian history, but Japanese history and culture. And reading this book taught me a lot about a cultural group that was living in Japan in the 20th century that I honestly hadn't really learned about before. So it was cool to kind of stick kind of within my wheelhouse, keep reading stuff that I already knew I was interested in, but read about a group that's totally, totally different than what I had already been familiar with. So the book that I have for us today is already a pretty famous one. It was published in 2017, and that same year it was one of the finalists for the National Book Award. It is a epic historical fiction novel that follows a Korean family who immigrates to Japan during the occupation of Korea. So the story features an ensemble of characters over the course of 4 generations in this family, spanning from the year 1910 all the way to 1989. So it covers almost the entirety of the 20th century. And over the course of the story, you see members of this family experience racism, experience discrimination and stereotyping, all the while trying to build a happy and successful life for themselves and for their children and their descendants. So my book that I have to share today is Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. And Min Jin Lee is a Korean American author who lives and writes out of Harlem in New York City. So at the beginning of the book, we begin at the turn of the century in Yeongdo, which is a small fishing village near Busan, where an aging fisherman and his wife run a boarding house. They have 3 sons, but only one of their sons, Huni, survives into adulthood. When Huni is 27, Japan annexes Korea. And many families after the annexation are left destitute and without food. But Huni's family is prudent, so their situation remains relatively stable. They have a pretty decent income running this boarding house. So Huni marries Youngjin, the daughter of a very poor farmer, and the two of them only have one surviving child, a daughter named Sunja. Sunja grows up very close to her father, but when she's 13, he dies suddenly of tuberculosis, leaving Sunja and Yangjun to run the boarding house on their own. They house a rotating cast of eccentric characters, including three brash young fishermen and a kind but very sickly young pastor named Bak Isak, who is on his way to Osaka. Almost immediately after arriving at the boarding house, Isak falls ill with tuberculosis, like what Sanja's father passed away from, and Yangjun and Sunja have to care for him as he's ill. So one day, while purchasing fish at the market in Busan, Sunja encounters a wealthy older man who is immediately infatuated with her. She avoids him out of shyness, but after watching her for weeks, he eventually seizes his opportunity to talk to her. And I should say, Sunja is, I think, 16 at this time. So this man is like very clearly quite a bit older than she is. On her way home from the market, Sunja is harassed by a group of Japanese boys. They make fun of how she looks and how she talks. And when the harassment becomes violent and is pushing on sexual harassment, the man who's been watching her steps in and scares them off in perfect, intimidating Japanese. He's handsome and charming and probably very wealthy based on how he's dressed. And Sunja learns that his name is Ko Hansu, and he's a fish broker. He's Korean, but he moved to Japan with his father when he was young and now lives in Osaka. Sunja is quite shy around Hansu, but she's curious. Who is this handsome older man, and why on earth would he be interested in a plain 16-year-old from a small town? Sunja allows Hansu to escort her back to Yongdo on the ferry, and they promise to meet each other on the beach in secret since Sunja does not want her family to see her with an older man. Sunja feels more worldly around Hansu. He tells her stories of Osaka, of his travels, and she gradually opens up to him more and more, developing stronger feelings for him. One day, instead of meeting on the beach, Sunja takes Hansu to the forest with her to pick mushrooms for the boarding house. And in the seclusion of the forest, he undresses her and sleeps with her on the forest floor, while Sunja cries. Later on, Sunja realizes that she's pregnant with Hansu's child. She's honestly pretty excited about it. She thinks he'll ask her to marry him and they can start a family together. He seems pretty well off, so she feels like she'll be really well supported. But when she tells Hansu that she's pregnant, he tells her that he has a wife and three daughters back in Osaka. He wants to buy Sunja a house where she can raise the baby in Korea, and she can be what he calls his wife in Korea. Sunja is pretty obviously disgusted and betrayed by this. Her thoughts are, how can this man who she has allowed to know her so intimately deceive her like this? And how can he be so different from the person that she thought she was getting to know? Sunja, from this point on, wants nothing to do with Hansu, and now she needs to figure out how to care for and raise a baby in a very small town without a father. No one will marry her now that she's ruined like this, and her naivete will bring dishonor on her family. As Sunja's pregnancy progresses, Bak Isak, the sickly pastor, is finally recovering from his tuberculosis scare. He was always a bit of an ill child, so he never planned on marrying since he didn't want to pass along his predisposition to illnesses. But when he realizes that Sunja is likely pregnant, and after discussing her situation with Yangjin, Sunja's mother, Isak offers to marry Sunja and take her to Osaka with him. He will raise her child as his own, and he feels that it's his duty since he wants to do something kind and meaningful with his life, and he doesn't feel like it's right for him to procreate himself, given his predisposition to sickness. So Sunja and Yangjin are very grateful for his offer, and soon he and Sunja are married. The book jumps forward in time, and now Sunja and Isak are arriving in Osaka, where they will live with Isak's brother Yoseb and his wife Kyung-hee. In Osaka, Sunja is shocked to learn that Koreans are treated poorly in Japan. She assumed that since Japan has more opportunities and more prosperity, that people weren't living in poverty there like they were in Korea. That wealthy, well-educated Koreans like Isak, who comes from a wealthy northern family and was very well educated, could pretty easily make a life for themselves in Japan. Contrary to her assumptions, most Koreans are forced to live in a small ghetto, regardless of their income or how much money they had back home. and are only hired for menial, poor-paying jobs, regardless of their education. Yoseb, Isak's brother, who they're living with, is quite traditional, and he insists on supporting the entire household of 4, almost 5, on his own salary. Kyung-hee and Sunja soon discover that Yoseb is in debt for paying for Sunja and Isak's passage to Osaka. So to pay off the debt, Sunja sells an expensive watch that was a gift to her from Hansu. Yoseb is furious by the women choosing to take agency over their decisions and he runs away and spends the entire night away. Meanwhile, that same night, Sunja gives birth to a son who they name Noah. The novel jumps forward again, and Sunja is raising her 2 sons now, Noah, fathered by Hansu, and Mozazu, fathered by Isak, and they're living in Osaka. Although, as you can see, most of the men in this family have biblical names. And shortly after Mozazu is born, Isak and his fellow pastor are arrested after a church employee is caught reciting the Lord's Prayer at a temple, where he should have been worshiping the emperor, not God. Isak remains in prison and is only released right before he dies, leaving Sunja to care for their sons on her own. Japan at this point has now entered World War II, and Sunja and Kyung-hee have to get crafty with ways to save money and make money while ingredients are becoming scarce. So they begin selling kimchi near the train station and are soon discovered by and employed at a restaurant where they work as cooks, much to Yoseb's dismay. When the restaurant is on the brink of closure due to ingredient scarcity, Hansu reappears, telling Sunja that he actually owns the restaurant and told the manager to employ her so that he could care for her. So Hansu is just constantly controlling the strings. So he arranges for her, for Kyung-hee, and for the 2 boys to go move to the countryside and live on a farm for the duration of the war, since the Allies are likely going to start bombing Japanese cities. He also arranges for Yoseb to go work in a factory in Nagasaki. And Yoseb ends up surviving the bombs, but he's severely injured and remains disabled for the rest of his life. Following the bombings and the subsequent end of the war, the family finally moved back to their home in Osaka, where Noah and Musazu continued their studies. In school, both of the boys face a lot of bullying, a lot of discrimination for being ethnically Korean, despite the fact that they were both born and had lived their entire lives in Japan. Zainichi Koreans, or Koreans who immigrated before 1945 and while Korea was still a part of the Japanese Empire, face many different types of discrimination in Japan. They're not considered citizens, regardless of whether or not they were born in Japan, and they struggle to find safe jobs and safe housing. Most of the Koreans living in Japan, regardless of their education and wealth, share the same experience of discrimination, with the exception of Ko Hansu, who we later learn benefits from his privileges due to being a member of the Yakuza. So in order to create better lives for themselves and make decent money, many Koreans resort to working in the pachinko business. They run gambling parlors with pachinko machines similar to slot machines, and despite not being considered clean and honorable work, it helps them make money to support their families. Mozazu, Sunja's second son, eventually goes into pachinko, as do other members of his family in the later parts of the book. And for them, they see pachinko as an opportunity. It's unpredictable and uncontrollable, much like their own stories, but they learn to embrace unpredictability and be grateful for the opportunities and the privileges that they have. So I really loved this book. It's like this sweeping historical fiction. As I said earlier, it covers like 80 years out of the 20th century. So there's a lot that happens in it. But I typically really enjoy family sagas, and I love like a well-researched and accurate historical fiction. Like I said earlier, I didn't really know anything about the Zainichi Korean experience before reading this, so like Koreans who were living in Japan during the war. But I completely trust Min Jin Lee. The prose is so detailed that I never suspected that she didn't know what she was talking about, which I can't say is true for all the historical fiction I've read recently. I also tend to really like books that are not necessarily about much, that don't have a lot of action in them, but that are more about, as Virginia so eloquently put earlier about human experiences and connections. And that's true to what this book is about. It's about like all of the different members of this family, all of the people that they encounter, the people coming in and out of their lives throughout the whole story, and how all their lives are affected. So like even in the last 100 pages, you're still meeting new characters because these are new people who are coming and going from the core family's lives. A lot definitely happens in it, despite the fact that it's not like plot heavy, because since the book is like just shy of 500 pages, but it's more about the day-to-day experiences of Sanja and her family than it is about any kind of heavy action. And it was really great to read about what I believe is an underrepresented experience. I learned so much about Zainichi Koreans and what they experienced as far as discrimination and oppression. And while the book was definitely very, very sad at times, it was also very moving. And I love a sad story, so I really, really enjoyed it. I actually switched off between reading the hard copy and listening to the audiobook, and both were really excellent. So I highly recommend checking it out in any format. Reading it it flows really nicely. It was very smooth to read, and I really enjoyed the audiobook narrator. So I'd recommend that as well. I would recommend this book if you enjoy family sagas, if you like books that are kind of sweeping and epic, if you like stories about immigrants and diaspora experiences, or if you want to learn more about a lesser known Asian ethnic and cultural group. And if you have lots of time on your hands and want to read a 500-page novel, then I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you check out Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. On to you, Karine.
Back to me. Because we're only three people today, I thought that our existential question would instead be a chance to, as Virginia always does, cheat. And mention just a couple of other books that, again, we usually only feature one book, but maybe some like quick blurbs of books that you would just like to highlight that haven't made the podcast yet. So maybe we'll start with Virginia, head cheater in chief.
Right? Like you're giving me more opportunity to stick in more books. Why, thank you. I was going to read, these are books I haven't finished or read yet. But that was what I was going to choose. One of them is Pizza Girl by Jean Kwang Frazier. She's a Korean American author. And because I know that Emma was picking Pachinko, that's why I'm like, okay, well, I can't pick that one. But it was about a sort of a coming age story about a pregnant pizza delivery girl. And this book always comes up like whenever I look for reader likes for books that I like these weird little like stories. So I have always wanted to read it, but just never got a chance to read it. But I borrowed it, and the first line was basically like her name was Jenny Hauser, and every Wednesday I put pickles on her pizza, which I think was a great, great first line. Anyway, so I feel like it's going to be one of those stories that I would really enjoy. I think it's been compared to Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Maruda. So like I think it's like that type of like quirky kind of weird story, but in a weird way that I think it would be great. So I'm waiting for that. The other one that I'm actually reading, I was going, and it was the other one on the spreadsheet that I was going to read is Book of which I halfway through, Book of Goose by Yilin Lee. And I wanted to pick like a writer like maybe from a background that I haven't read before, so that's why I did Welcome to Me to My Kingdom. But Book of Goose by Yilin Lee, she is a Chinese American writer. It was amazing because I think she came to the States when she was 23, and she writes like absolutely like it's just beautifully. Oh my gosh, like every sentence you can tell is just like carefully crafted, that every single word has been considered by her. And having sort of came to a place and have to learn English when I was like 15, I'm like, how do you write like this, which is like ridiculous. But anyway, just so good. And that was like I'm totally reading it for the writing, because the story is probably not quite my type of book. It's sort of a female friendship about these two girls, Fabiana and Agnes, who grew up in rural France. And the book begins with Agnes getting a letter from her mom telling her that, oh, Fabiana has died in childbirth. And it's almost like her mom forgot how much Fabiana means to Agnes. And so we go back in time to watch these two girls develop. And Fabiana is sort of the strong one, like the ones who have all the ideas. And then Agnes is sort of like her counterpart. But, we sort of get it from Agnes' point of view about this sort of female friendship, and it's kind of inexplicable as the book described it. Agnes is like, well, you can't explain why people get together, or like two people, why they are so fascinated with each other, why these two, and then she was like, I don't know, I have other people in my school that I could have been friends with, but no, every day once I get off school, I just want to go see Fabiana. And so it's just about that friendship, and sort of what happened to them and how Agnes got out of France during this wartime. It's absolutely beautiful. It was funny. I was telling Fiona about it. Fiona was, that sounds like my kind of book. I'm like, yeah, that totally sounds like your kind of book. But the writing is just so absolutely amazing. So I cannot wait to get finish that book. And she also has a recent short story collection called Wednesday Child, which I think I'm definitely gonna read after that because it is just so good. Anyway.
Of course. Excellent. All right, Emma, what about you? Or you're kind of like your runners up today?
I'm not like Virginia in that I don't have like a laundry list of books that I could have chosen from. I did have one runner up that was recommended to me. It's also another older book. So I ended up not doing it because it had been talked about on the podcast before. And I've realized that my curse is that every time I'm like, oh, that's a book that I really want to read, I should see if I can do it for the podcast. And I search it in the spreadsheet, it's always Liz that has talked about it before. So apparently Liz and I have the same reading because Liz and I were talking about Pachinko, and she was like, have I not done Pachinko already? And like she's read it and she recommended it to Fiona, I think, but she didn't pod about it, so I did it today. So the other book was A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. So that's one that my partner actually recommended it to me and said that I would really enjoy it. And I was like, oh my God, this totally sounds like something I would love. I like Japanese American experience. I like kind of sad, dark books. I'm pretty sure it's also about depressing family stuff. So that was one that like just appealed to me in general, but I didn't get the chance to be able to do it today. I mean, anything by like I could have done Osamu Dazai, I could have done Akutagawa, I could have done like name a Bungo Stray Dogs character, I could have done any of their books. But I'd been wanting to read Pachinko for a long time. So when I saw that we were doing Asian Heritage Month, I was like, that's my opportunity to be able to do it. Because nowadays I can only really read things. I only really have the time to read things if I'm reading for the podcast. So because I'm like, if I don't read for the podcast, I'm not going to finish my reading for the podcast. So I used this week as an opportunity to read a book that's been on my list for a while. And I'm really glad that I did. So this was it was my second choice because I would have done A Tale for the Time Being, but this is like the book that I really, really wanted to do for today.
I'm glad you already found like a book twin, right? That's because I don't, yeah, right?
We have aligning tastes. I don't think we read like exactly the same stuff, but we like a lot of the stuff that Liz likes, I also like, and you know.
Because I don't like, I mean, Korean and I don't have a book twin, I don't think. We're book enemies, that's what we got. Right? Book
You're very unique,
nemesis,
Virginia.
not enemy, nemesis.
I like that. You're my you're my book nemesis. I really like that. Yeah. Yeah, I have had You Mary's The End of August on my bookshelf for such a long time. It's so big. I know. Virginia's doing like the hand motion, like it's so big. I couldn't find anywhere to put it in my house. I had to like rearrange my bookshelves to find somewhere to sit, and it ended up being like on the very tippity top of my bookshelves, like on top of the bookshelves themselves, and so I haven't been able to kind of like bring it down because there's a bunch of books stacked on top of it. I've like, as you all know, like a book buying problem. But she's the author of Tokyo Ueno Station. And again, she kind of writes about the same themes that you did, Emma. So I was like, okay, if you're doing Pachinko, then I'm gonna try something else. But I'm hoping that I will get to it and maybe talk about it on the podcast one day because I think she's just an exceptional writer, and the topic that she's writing about is so interesting, and I think she's going to do very interesting things with it. But I really just have to carve out, like, maybe I'll take a week off or something. Because as I have talked about on this podcast, usually if I'm reading a book, I'm sitting down and reading the entire thing in one go. So if it's that chunky, I really have to have like a good space of time for it. There's a novella by Yukio Mishima called Star that I have read. I think kind of it was recommended to me after I read Idle Burning, which was one of my favorite books of that year. And it is a book that I constantly find myself thinking about, and yet we'll probably never talk about on this podcast. For whatever reason, like it never fits the topic, and it's kind of like it's a very strange look at like the idol system in Japan. If you've ever seen kind of like the bizarre film, the 1985 Legend of the Stardust Brothers, it's kind of that vibe, and you're like, what is going on? What is happening? I don't know what's happening, but I like it. And this book in itself is such a like a fascinating, cynical view of like celebrity and idol culture, and so I really enjoyed it. I just haven't found like the chance to talk about it yet. And then I was going to be extremely cheeky and maybe do Beyond the Story, the BTS autobiography memoir by Myung-Suk Kang, translated by Anton Hurst, Lin Jung, and Claire Richards. But I thought that I would spare you, or maybe keep that in my back pocket for another time, to just fully dig in and make you learn all about the history. Yeah, so thank you so much to my book friends. Even though we are a small number today, I feel like we gave a lot of recommendations. I'm glad that we had like a collection of short stories. I'm glad we had a novel. I'm glad I got to talk about poetry and translation for a long time, and maybe like tempt Virginia into some poetry, or at least the essay section of it. Okay, well, I tried. I tried my darndest.
I mean, it's a
Again,
fascinating story. It's a fascinating story. I'm glad that you share it. I think that's just like, it shows how, yeah, like who knows, right? Like, who knows what else is being just like slapped onto like whatever without people knowing. So yeah, no, it's a great story. It's an important story to share. And I'm glad you did. But it's poetry, Miss Corinne. It's poetry. I do it once a year for this podcast. And that's it.
Fair enough. You have made many sacrifices for this podcast, so I will respect that. Yep. So as we always say when we are taking a month to kind of celebrate very a group of voices, this May, but not only this May, take the time to really seek out those voices. And again, because of our society that we live in, sometimes you'll have to do a little bit more digging, put in a little bit more effort. But we are here to tell you that it will be well worth it. So enjoy your May from us in April. We hope the weather's good. And but not too good. We hope at least one rainy weekend where you can curl up with a nice book and have a happy reading experience. Bye-bye.